would love to trade places with you, but something tells me it wouldn't be in the best interest of the Smithsonian. So we'll all keep our jobs. The Smithsonian's mission is to increase and diffusion of knowledge. As the 13th Secretary of the Smithsonian, you are entrusted with the challenging responsibilities of operating and managing one of our country's most revered institutions. The Smithsonian is often referred to as America's attic. And no wonder, you are the steward of more than 138 million objects in the national collection that reflects America's artistic, cultural, and scientific heritage. The Smithsonian provides education and outreach programs in art, culture, history, and science for visitors and scholars alike. It's governed by a Board of Regents consisting of the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the Vice President, 9 private citizens, and 6 members of Congress, including our good friend Tom Cole, who serves on this subcommittee. Overall, the proposed funding level in the Smithsonian's fiscal year 2017 budget request is $922.2 million, which is $82 million, or about 10% above fiscal year 2016 enacted level. Compared with other major accounts under this subcommittee's jurisdiction, your request is one of the most ambitious as measured on a percentage basis. Like most big organizations, the Smithsonian faces some enormous challenges, which we'll be discussing at some length today. The subcommittee recently learned of the need for enormously costly repairs to the National Air and Space Museum. If approved, this effort will place extraordinary burdens on the Smithsonian's annual budget for the foreseeable future. The subcommittee congratulates the Smithsonian on the news of the opening of the National Museum of African American History and Culture on September 24th this year. The committee has met its funding commitment, providing $270 million, or one-half the total cost toward construction of the museum. We are pleased that this extraordinary public-private partnership enabling the museum to be built has proven successful, and the construction is now nearly complete. The construction of the African American Museum and the proposed repairs of the National Air and Space Museum are illustrative of the very real challenges this subcommittee faces. There is both increasing demand for and shrinking supply of federal dollars to address many legitimate priorities. For this reason, it's essential that the Smithsonian outline and clearly communicate its highest and greatest priorities. Every member of this subcommittee would like to support a 10% increase for funding for the Smithsonian. But given the incredible demands across this bill, it's probably not realistic. Difficult funding decisions will have to be made. The subcommittee will do its very best to address the Smithsonian's most urgent priorities. I look forward to your testimony and continuing to work together. In closing, I want to commend you for the Smithsonian's efforts to improve the display and storage of your vast collections. Based on the input this committee receives from members from both sides of the aisle, it's very clear that the preservation and the care of these priceless and irreplaceable collections remain a high priority of this committee and this Congress. I'm now happy to yield to my good friend and subcommittee's ranking member, Mrs. McCollum, for any opening remarks she'd like to make.
Thank you. I would like to also join the chairman in welcoming you here this morning, Doctor. This is going to be your first budget hearing before the subcommittee. You were officially installed as Secretary of the Smithsonian this past October, and I am pleased to have an opportunity on the subcommittee to learn more about your vision for the institution and how you plan on working through some of the challenges the chairman has pointed out. The Smithsonian was created for an increase in diffusion of knowledge. It has the ability to capture the imagination and the curiosity of both children and adults. It has something for everyone. In particular, the unique imaginations, a children's space at the National Museum of American Indians is truly a delight for families. The interactive crafts, native book stories, the exploratory learning that's there. I have to tell you, it's a destination for some young children I know well whenever they go to the Nation's Mall. I also want to applaud you for the triumphant reopening of the Renwick, which is providing a true experience of wonder and joy for the record number of visitors, young people and adults alike. I got to be there for the opening exhibits. It was fabulous. The Smithsonian Institution FY17 budget request is $922 million. It's an increase of $82 million over the 2016 enacted level. These increases will help support the Smithsonian's robust research programs, strengthen its diverse collections, and make essential investments for both the facility and the workforce. In regards to your collection, I would note that the administration has not proposed funding for Save America's Treasures program. The National Park Service program began in 1999 and it was instrumental in partnering with others to preserve national historic collections, some of which are housed in your museums at the Smithsonian. For example, the Star-Spangled Banner flag was a recipient of Save America's Treasures. I hope, if given an opportunity, the Smithsonian will support efforts to restore this important Park Service program, which has a direct connection to being able to preserve your collections. Like other agencies in the subcommittee's jurisdiction, the Smithsonian is facing challenges with its facility and maintenance backlog. Many of the museums are still operating under their original major building systems and equipment, and some are more than 50 years old. Currently, the Smithsonian's overall facilities condition index rating from the National Research Council is considered poor. In order to achieve acceptable facilities condition index score and ensure a health and safety for visitors, staff, and, yes, at the zoo, the animals in its care, the budget requests $163 million. This amount would continue major renovations and efforts at the National Zoo and other priority areas, including the National Museum of American History and the National Museum of Natural History. It also provides $50 million increase for the National Air and Science Museum, beloved by millions and one of the most visited museums in the world. Unfortunately, the museum is facing significant challenges with the deteriorating facade, which allows moisture into the building, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that, Mr. Chairman. This funding is the first of several significant increases the Smithsonian will be requesting to address the issues at the Air and Space Museum. We'll fund pre-construction activities at the museum and construction of off-site storage. Although these are large investments, they are in the long-term interest of the nation. It is also the federal government's responsibility to provide the necessary funding to ensure the 28 million visitors to the Smithsonian are welcomed each year and have a safe and enriching experience. So I am pleased that the National Museum of African American History and Culture will be opening this fall. The museum will provide a place to learn about the rich history and cultural experience and achievements of Americans of African descent. It will also be the first digital museum on the National Mall. That means anyone can share the experience. Lonnie Bunch, when he was out in Minnesota, were talking about it. People in Minnesota are so excited that they're going to be able to be there as part of the opening. So virtual collections provide amazing educational opportunities for millions of children, and you're bringing the museum right into classrooms, and I say that as a social studies teacher. So, Doctor, I appreciate the work that you and all the employees at the Smithsonian do to achieve civic, educational, and scientific and artistic life of this nation and preserve it. So I look forward to your testimony. I yield back, Mr. Chair, and I thank you for the time.
Thank you. And with that, Dr. Skorton, I'm happy to yield to you your opening statement. You're recognized.
Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee, thank you for this opportunity to testify. On behalf of the entire Smithsonian Institution, we appreciate the continuous, generous support of Congress. This support makes our huge and varied collections of national treasures accessible to the American public. From care and display of the Star-Spangled Banner to research on the evolution of T-Rex, we take our obligation to the American people very seriously. We leverage the federal dollars with private support to expand our reach and capabilities. This unique public-private partnership is working well. In July, I was privileged to begin my tenure as the 13th Secretary of the Smithsonian. I am most honored and humbled to be a part of this great institution. Today, I would like to share just a few of our recent achievements and then touch on the two major objectives, the two major categories of funding, strengthening our intellectual foundation and programs and strengthening our physical infrastructure. Your support advances the civic, educational, scientific, and artistic life of our nation. Just a few recent highlights. Our stunning new National Museum of African American History and Culture opens on the National Mall this September. Smithsonian scientists use our collections to provide important and very practical insights on a variety of topics. Consider the Zika virus. The Department of Defense is working with our National Museum of Natural History to study and map the Zika outbreak. The National Zoo is exploring how it might spread through non-human vectors. And the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute in Panama is examining the Zika-carrying mosquitoes' genetic makeup. Always, but perhaps especially in an election year, the National Museum of American History and the National Portrait Gallery offer revealing insights into our nation's leaders. Our diverse music-related collections would comprise the largest music museum in the world if they were all in one place. And now, in a sense, they are at a new website called Smithsonian Music. The Smithsonian American Art Museum's Renwick Gallery reopened to the public in November following a 2-year renovation. Its debut exhibition, Wonder, has attracted more than 368,000 visitors in just the first 4 months. And in 2015, we welcomed a new panda cub, Bebe, at the National Zoo. Beloved by the public, Bebe represents our extensive work in species biodiversity. In addition to the nearly 30 million visits at our museums in Washington and New York City, we are extending access and education across the country. We now have 208 affiliate museums in 46 states, Puerto Rico, and Panama, and the Smithsonian Traveling Exhibition Service reaches more than 4.5 million people annually. We offer online educational materials in the K through 12 to students at all ages and teachers with more than 2,000 learning resources available online, and all of them for free. Our Science Education Center has been helping to transform formal science education on the K through 12 level for more than 30 years, and this curriculum is used in every state in the country and in 25 other countries around the world. We have more than 138 million objects in our collections, and to expand access, we have created millions of digital images and electronic records, and we've become leaders in the field of three-dimensional scanning. I was recently at the National Air and Space Museum as our experts carefully climbed into the Apollo 11 command module to create a three-dimensional scan of its interior, revealing for the first time notes and a calendar written inside by American astronauts. What a discovery. All this information we will offer online this summer for everyone to explore for free. Such treasures explain why the Air and Space Museum is always among the top 3 most visited museums in the world, and we are gearing up to transform it so that it will be there for generations to come. And this is a perfect example of one of our major objectives, strengthening our physical infrastructure. Our request also includes funds for construction of the Air and Space Museum's collections module at the Udvar-Hazy Center in Virginia, funds for revitalization projects, and funds for planning and design of future projects. These funds will enable the institution to continue major revitalization work at the National Museum of Natural History, the National Zoo, and the National Museum of American History. And as mentioned, our other priority is strengthening our intellectual foundation and programs. Our ranks of curators throughout the institution have shrunk substantially, especially in some of our museums. We need to reverse this long-term trend in the loss of curatorial and research staff. We need new experts who can continue to acquire and exhibit our unique collections while also ensuring the availability of the collections for critical research. The Smithsonian does face a future that holds both exciting opportunities and imposing challenges, and working with the Congress and the administration, we will aggressively address these challenges and take full advantage of many new opportunities. Again, I thank you for the opportunity of testifying. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Doctor. As you mentioned in your opening statement, the National Air and Space Museum, which is the most visited museum in the United States and second most visited in the world behind only the Louvre in Paris, is in need of some major repair work. The projections I've seen project the total cost to to be extraordinary, nearly $600 million. This amount exceeds the total cost of the new Museum of African American History and Culture. Can you explain in some detail the nature of the repairs needed and why the estimated cost to address them is so high?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The museum, as you know, is about 40 years old, and so we have projected for a long time the need to update mechanical systems in the building. And that accounts for something on the order of magnitude of $200 million of the projected cost. Much of the rest of the cost is due to an unanticipated problem that was found in the cladding or exterior of the building, which will require replacement by new cladding for the safety of the public going into the building and for the building's own integrity. It will also be necessary, from my perspective, to keep as much of the museum open during the revitalization as possible, given the enormous appetite that the American public has to visit the museum and to gain from its collections. So some of the funding will go for the necessity to move items to off-site storage while a particular part of the museum is being worked on, and then move it back at that right interval. And when you add all these things up, it does come out to an extraordinary number. Our plan is to continue planning for this project for approximately another year, and then to actually do the construction over a 5-year period from fiscal 2018 through fiscal 2022.
I'm going to ask this question because if I don't, somebody's going to ask me, why didn't you ask it? And people are going to be curious. What would the replacement cost to just tear the existing museum down and rebuild it?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This was the very first question I asked when I was brought on board, and they told me about the very challenging price tag on repairing this building. And although it's counterintuitive, although it does, at first you would think it would be much more parsimonious to replace the building, it turns out to be much more expensive, on the order of magnitude of $2 billion. And please bear with me while I explain a little bit about why that would be. We would have to have a place to move the entire collection. And since it's such an enormous building, with such an enormous collection, all the objects that are in there, including some very large objects, we'd have to rent or build a massive storage facility. We would have to shut the museum down for years, and in addition to the very generous, steadfast support that Congress has given us across the whole Smithsonian, we also have been able to raise some considerable funds through retail operations, IMAX Theater, the shops, and so on. And of course, that would all be off. We would lose that revenue. And so when you add it all up, although, as I say, it's counterintuitive, it turns out that this, even though a very expensive project, to replace it while keeping, let's say, half of the museum open throughout the project is actually much less expensive than it would be to replace the entire building. But I thank you for the question.
Sure. And of the $600 million, how much do you anticipate would be funded through federal appropriations, and how much would be addressed through non-federal funding sources?
In this particular case, I have to ask that the entire amount be funded through federal means, and may I please expand on that, Mr. Chairman? I've had the great opportunity in my career to participate in fundraising of a variety of distinguished nonprofit institutions, and the Smithsonian also uses the leverage that you supply by such steadfast support to do philanthropic fundraising. In my experience, it's difficult to raise philanthropic funds for a repair or replacement type of procedure as opposed to something new. And I must hasten to add that in the planning for the future of the National Air and Space Museum, we have plans for approximately $250 million of changes to the way we show exhibits to the public, increased use of interactive and electronic technology, a whole different approach. And we intend to raise those funds, the additional $250 million, through philanthropy, and we're already on our way to do that. But the actual reconstruction of the building itself, I'm asking be done completely through federal funds.
Well, before I ask Betty to take over and ask a few questions, why don't you explain some of the items that you brought here to show us and to show everyone
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Although I gave you an amateur's run-through before, I'd like to introduce some professionals who could give you more in-depth, although succinct, discussion. I'm going to name them all, and then they'll get up in the order in which I named them. And I want to thank you on all of our behalf for allowing us to share a bit of the collection with you today. Dr. Harry Rubenstein of the National Museum of American History has brought the inkwell used by President Abraham Lincoln to sign the Emancipation Proclamation. Ann Schumard of the National Portrait Gallery has the so-called cracked plate portrait of Abraham Lincoln taken by the president's favorite photographer. Dr. Kelly Corrick of the Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory has brought a prototype of a protective heat shield, part of NASA's Solar Probe Plus spacecraft. And Dr. Eleanor Harvey of the Smithsonian American Art Museum has brought Thomas Moran's beautiful watercolor of the Excelsior Geyser at Yellowstone National Park.
America's first national park, right?
I've been warned to stay out of this argument. So it's above my pay grade, above my pay grade. Harry?
Second park acquired, by the way.
Whatever you say in the aggregate, I agree with completely.
Hi, my name is Harry Rubenstein. I'm the chair of the Division of Political History at the National Museum of American History. And this is a inkstand that sat on the desk of Thomas Eckert, Major Thomas Eckert, at the War Department's telegraph office. And as you know, Abraham Lincoln would go to the telegraph office once or twice a day to keep tabs on what was happening during the Civil War. And in the summer of 1862, rather than swapping stories and jokes with the telegraph operators, he sat quietly at Major Eckert's desk and began to work on what became the Emancipation Proclamation. And so Major Eckert kept this and eventually saved it and presented it to the government. The inkwell will be in the opening of the African American Museum, and will then move back to American history for our exhibition on American democracy. Thank you. And so what these are, so you can see that these are in, part of the stand, but these are little inkwells. And what's on top are little figures of griffins. Griffins.
Thank you, Harry. Please. You have to use this mic.
Yes, thank you. Hello, I'm Ann Schumard, and I'm the Senior Curator of Photographs at the National Portrait Gallery. And this is one of the portrait galleries and one of the Smithsonian's genuine treasures. It is a portrait of Abraham Lincoln that was taken by Alexander Gardner at Gardner's studio here in Washington, D.C., which was located at the corner of 7th and D Streets Northwest. It was taken on February 5th of 1865, just a month before Lincoln's second inaugural. And at the time, of course, that the picture was taken, there was the expectation that there would be many opportunities to photograph the president during his upcoming second term. The large glass plate negative that was used to produce this print cracked probably when a varnish was applied to it after it was developed. And so just one print was made from this large glass negative before the negative was discarded. It was irreparably damaged. What of course, makes this image so evocative, I think, today is the expression that we have on Lincoln's face. This is a man who has seen so much trial and tragedy, but there is that hope, I think you almost see in that sort of faint smile, that the war that has torn the nation asunder is drawing to a close, and there is hope for the future. The portrait came to the Portrait Gallery's collection in 1981, and it is, as I say, one of the true treasures of our holdings.
Thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Dr. Kelly Corrick, and I brought with me today a prototype of the Solar Probe Cup. This cup is going to fly in 2018 a NASA Solar Probe mission. This is a mission to actually touch the sun. And here in the picture, you'll see that we're actually sticking out there and going to collect parts of the sun. And it's not just a scientific enterprise, but it's also somewhat practical. Understanding the sun and what it throws at us actually will help us understand space weather, which can help us save our national power grid, as well as communication satellites. And so this is a part of one of the 4 instrument suites. There's other instrument suites aboard here, and they're all going to fly in 2018.
Thanks so much. Eleanor?
Good morning. My name is Eleanor Harvey. I'm the Senior Curator of 19th Century Art at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. As a former geologist, as well as an art historian, I bring to you today Thomas Moran's watercolor of Excelsior Geyser in Yellowstone, painted in 1873, the year after Congress, in its wisdom, set aside Yellowstone as America's first national park. The park behind you, Yosemite, was set aside by Abraham Lincoln as a protected preserve at the middle of the Civil War as a post-war sanctuary, recognizing the power of nature as something we hold dear as part of America's cultural infrastructure. This watercolor was reproduced along with a suite of others to help promote visitorship to Yellowstone. I also see the See America proposals from the WPA. They were based on a Northern Pacific Railroad campaign called See Europe, but See America First, in order to get people out to places like Yellowstone. They created both the railroads and the infrastructure so that you could go watch Old Faithful and Excelsior Geyser erupt in full display. So it was a patriotic moment in America when we recognized that we have such unique features in this country that actually instill a kind of civic pride and make people want to explore the vastness of the country that we have here.
Thank you. And I want to be quick to indicate that the comment on that being the first one was a historical, not a political comment. Thank you, Eleanor.
Well, since we have the portrait of Abraham Lincoln here, who wisely designated Yosemite to be the first federally acquired eventual park, that was very wise of him.
Yes, it was.
Yeah.
I love Yosemite.
As Secretary, Mr. Chairman, I must say that I and the entire Smithsonian family values every single aspect of the American park system
That's right.
and the Park Service itself celebrating its 100th
We all do. We
anniversary.
just have this private joke going. Ms. McCullum.
Thank you. I'm sure Ms. Pingree is going to make a plug for her park. But we have some great ones in Minnesota, too. I wanted to just kind of take an opportunity. We had we met in the office, and then I've been doing more and more homework, and so I want to understand kind of better where you see yourself going in the future, because now that we have all these these surprises, should I say, for the Air and Science Museum renovation. So last January, the Board of Regents gave the Smithsonian permission to explore creating exhibit space in London. And it's my understanding such a venture would be done completely using private funds, but you've been talking about leveraging a lot of private funds here today for current collections and current buildings. I'm concerned that Congress has not been a full part of this discussion, and I bring this up because at a minimum, the Smithsonian is an establishment of the United States, and its funds are held in the U.S. Treasury. In the event of a lawsuit, it's represented by the Department of Justice, so we are intertwined here. And in 2006, the Smithsonian entered into a business venture with Showtime Networks that drew the ire of Congress because it lacked a consultation. So this was former Secretary Small later admitted the hindsight of the Smithsonian should have consulted with the Congress. So you can tell us when we can expect to learn more about the Smithsonian's findings regarding London. Maybe it's on hold. How do you plan on consulting with Congress? And as you look around and you're addressing the problems, as I said earlier, at your domestic facilities like the National Zoo, can you really rely on having enough private contributions from private foundations like the Friends of the National Zoo to assist you with the deferred maintenance operation? So if not, will you have to come back and ask the federal government to address some of these problems? So kind of give us an update of where you are in London and elsewhere. And then if time permits, I have a question on the Arts and Industry Building as well. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. I'd like to try to answer what I heard were three questions within your three embedded questions. First of all, on the extremely important matter of consultation with Congress, not only do we get 2/3 of our funding because of your generosity and foresight, but we are an organization in the public trust. So I couldn't agree with you more. It's hard for me to look backwards on what might or might not have happened in earlier consultation, but I pledge to you today and to the entire subcommittee that we will make consultation and transparency a hallmark of our administration. I think it's very, very important for all the reasons that you stated, including but not limited to the issues that you brought up. Secondly, I heard you raise the very, very important issue of leveraging federal funds in other ways. And I'll be very quick about this, but we do that in two ways, in what I'm going to call roughly business or retail operations, like the shops and the museums, the IMAX theaters, and the magazine, other things that you can purchase something or derive a benefit. And then secondly, philanthropy, outright gifts. And the Smithsonian has been very effective in both the retail and philanthropic side of the house. But as you mentioned, and as the chairman mentioned, the needs are very challenging, and it's going to take everything that we can do to keep faith with the very strong support that you've given us, and keep faith with those who purchase things from us and those who give philanthropic donations. So I take that very seriously, and I believe, as a personal comment, a personal observation, still new at the Smithsonian and new in Washington, I believe part of the reason that my predecessors, especially Secretary Clough and Secretary Horvath, were so successful in raising philanthropic funds is because of the stalwart congressional support. And it's been my experience in other public institutions raising philanthropy that when there is solid public funding, other people will also join in. So I thank you very much for that, because you made the philanthropy possible. But now getting to the main focus of your question about London, it ties together a lot of these issues that you raised up. And I think the opportunity for the United States to tell its story overseas in a time of, obviously today is one of those terrible days where we're thinking so much about the international situation. I think being able to tell the story of America overseas would be a good thing for the Smithsonian and a good thing for the country. However, given the pressure on federal funds that the chairman has indicated and the pressure on us that you, Congresswoman, have indicated, we have to make sure, and I've already pledged earlier and will pledge again today, that we will not use federal funds from the United States for this project, and will not do the project unless the finances can stand completely on their own, including not interrupting other flows of funds that we have to do, and I believe that's what you're asking me. I can't tell you today whether the project will in fact come to fruition. I hope to be able to have an answer for you through our Board of Regents on the second week in April at our next full Board of Regents meeting. But I think it's an exciting prospect. We have to have it stand completely on its own bottom, and I'm not there yet.
Real quick, the Smithsonian Arts and Industry Building, it's an icon on the National Mall. It's right next to the castle. It's an important role of the history of the Smithsonian. At one time, it was included by the National Trust for Historic Preservation as one of the most endangered historic sites in the United States. So the building was closed in 2004 for renovations. In fact, it was just last spring, almost 10 years later, that the Smithsonian announced that it was opening the building for short-term exhibits. So could you please update the committee on how you see the Arts and Industry Building fitting into your South Campus, the current condition of the building, and when will you finally be able to host events? And is the challenge still a properly adequate plumbing and HVAC systems there? And then I hope that you also talk to Congress and about renovating the gardens there too, because we're already starting to hear about that right adjacent to the building.
Thank you very, very much. And let me talk specifically about the Arts and Industries building, and then if you have more specific questions about the garden or the areas around, I'm very glad to answer those as well. I have one of these dream jobs, and one of the parts of my dream jobs is I have a dream office that looks right at the Capitol. And in my line of sight to the Capitol is the Arts and Industries building, and also the carousel where I'm watching a lot of young people enjoy. As I look at those three objects, I often focus on the Arts and Industries building and ask myself the first time I came for interviews nearly 2 years ago, what were we going to do with this beautiful Victorian building, second oldest building in the Smithsonian universe? And as you said, only very recently has the building been reopened. The systems that you mentioned are up and running now. I asked for my installation to be there. It was last October. Thank you for recognizing that. And it was a beautiful chance to use the building. And so it is ready for those occasional uses right now. We're opening it for those kinds of uses this year. We are beginning to plan and are not at the point yet where I have something concrete and intelligent to share with you about some more strategic uses of the building going forward. But it's another one of those areas, Congresswoman, where we need to stay in touch with this and the other subcommittees who oversee and appropriate funds for the Smithsonian. But this will be the year, this very calendar year that we're in, where you will begin to see more use made of that building.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll follow up with your staff on the questions on the gardens.
Thank you very much.
Sure. Mr. Joyce.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have no questions at this time. I just think I've been bringing together these wonderful exhibits for our observation.
Thank you for all that you do for us.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much for being here, Dr. Skorton, and thank you to everyone who brought such interesting exhibits for us to see. That was really a pleasure. We're very appreciative of the work that you do. And I echo all the things that my colleagues have said earlier. I just want to talk a little bit about some of the things that you do through the Smithsonian outside of D.C. I represent Maine, and we've been very fortunate to work with you on a variety of things. Recently, the Portland Museum of Art had a major retrospective on Richard Estes' realism, which we were able to do with the cooperation of the Smithsonian. And that is really important for small states like ours that don't always have the resources, but are lucky to access your resources. I want to talk a little bit about the Marine Geo program that is growing within the Smithsonian, and it's a very important part of what you do in research. I have a lot of coastal communities, of course, that are interested in things like climate change, but we don't have a Marine Geo site in Maine. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the additional funds that are requested for Marine Geo staff. Will you be able to expand the number of partner sites? Have you thought about how you could work with smaller, more narrowly focused organizations that are interested in becoming research sites, either by providing additional financial resources to help them expand their research or encouraging a consortium model which would allow them to contribute? So that's one of our particular interests.
Thank you very much. And I hear two important questions embedded in what you asked me. If I may take just a moment to talk about our activities outside of D.C., it's very, very important. It's really a lucky subset of the United States that can get to the mall. And it's expensive to get here. One of the reasons that my predecessors began this very vigorous thrust on digitization is so that people anywhere who have access to the internet, which is most but not all, can have a chance to view major parts of the collection. And also, being in the public sector for most of my career, I think for a federally funded institution where the taxpayers are paying for it in every corner of the country, it's exquisitely important that we're responsive to their appetite to taste the Smithsonian. Besides the affiliate museums, the 208, and the Traveling Exhibition Service, both of which were embedded in your comment about the Portland Museum, we have other projects that, through the research end of it, touch the nation and the world. And our mission, which was part of the letter that James Smithson wrote to establish the endowment 170 years ago, our mission is the increase and diffusion of knowledge. We talk a lot about the diffusion of knowledge, that is the interface between the public and these unbelievable collections. But the increase part, the research part, is unbelievably important, whether we're talking about Zika, climate change, you name it. And so the Forest and Marine Geo Consortia, I'm going to call them consortia, were set up to do just exactly what you said, that is to have the benefit of the research thinking of the Smithsonian, touching communities everywhere, and to help gain knowledge that would raise all the ships. And so for those who are not familiar with it, the Marine Geo is a project that studies coastal waterways. And coastal waterways are very, very important because that's the area where there is a tremendous concentration of life forms, and in our country, a tremendous concentration of population. And so the interaction between the human population and the wildlife that lives at the edge of the coastal areas is very important to study. We do not have enough funding so far to expand the extent that I would like to expand. We do have a request as part of this budget request to continue staffing and planning for Marine Geo. Marine Geo was made possible actually through a combination of your support and the very generous contribution of an individual from our Smithsonian National Board. And so it's my hope to leverage again the funds that you give us through philanthropy so that we can begin to think more broadly about bringing more partners on. And so we have very good intentions in that regard, and I need to be cautious in what I promise because we do need to raise more funds. But I think, having spent my whole life in my whole career in science, that it's very important that scientific research touches not only different parts of the country, but that scientists and people who want to participate be able to in areas far spread. So I'm totally with you on intention, and we'll work to do my best to make that a reality.
Great. We'll look
Thank you very
forward to
much.
staying in touch about that.
That
Thank
would
you
be
very
great.
much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Simpson.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for being here today. We got votes that have just started and going on, so come by my office and talk to me. I'd like to talk to you about some of the things, some of the Panama, what's going on in Panama, and what the Smithsonian does there is obviously important. I want to talk to you about the cladding. Is this the same thing that happened with the National Art Gallery that needed to be replaced, the exterior of it?
Yeah, may I answer that,
Yeah.
that piece of it? In a sense, yes. In a sense, no. Isn't that a helpful answer?
Yeah.
And the
It's a political answer. I give that answer all the time.
I'm going to stay away from the national park on this one. But it turns out that the cladding, when it was cut for the National Gallery of Art, of which I serve as a board member, was cut to a thickness about twice as thick as the thickness of the cladding on the National Air and Space Museum. Our thinner cladding was done, as I understand it, to save funds and speed along construction at a time when they were trying to get the building done for the bicentennial. And so in the case of the National Gallery of Art, Congressman, it was possible to reuse that thicker cladding. It's not going to be possible to reuse this cladding. It'll be discarded, and we got to start from scratch. And that's part of the reason, in my answer to the chairman's most important and reasonable question, why it's such an expensive project.
Is it the same issue relative to what caused the necessity for replacing it?
In part it is, yes.
Okay. And the other thing I'd like to talk to you about at some point in time when we have some time is, are you getting pressure on the Arts and Industry building down there to use it for the Hispanic Museum?
So the...
Or is that a question you don't want to answer?
No, I want to answer any question you have. I just want to give you the right answer. So first of all, part of our charge, part of what you expect us to do is to tell the story of America in all its completeness and beauty. And the story of the American Latino has to be a very important part of telling that story. So as you know, a new museum for the Smithsonian is always established by an act of Congress. That act has not occurred. However, my predecessors have already begun some years ago to begin to gear up our efforts to tell the story of Latinos in America, again, through the two secretaries who preceded me. We have a project that you've been very generous in funding for a Latino fund that allows us to fund some projects within the Smithsonian. That's been very, very effective. We also have been hiring, even though we don't have a specific museum, we've been hiring curators with expertise in telling the story of Latinos in America, and they're working in various places throughout the institution through the Smithsonian Latino Center. And we have multiple exhibits, something on the order of 5 or 6 in this last year, touching on some of those areas. So it'll be in your hands to decide, should we have a National Museum of the American Latino? But in the meantime, we are pushing ahead, and I am pushing it to tell more completely the story of the American Latino.
Thank you, I appreciate that, and I got to tell you, it's not fair that you get to bring in all this neat stuff, and it distracts us so that we don't even listen to your testimony or care about your budget. And, you know, I mean, the EPA could bring in something with quagga mussels all over it, but it's not very exciting, or this is just, you have an advantage that others don't.
It's true, the world isn't fair, but I'm so glad to be on my
Thank
side
you.
of it. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Israel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Skorton, thank you for your work and for bringing these treasures. I want to follow up on Ms. Pingree's question, your comments on the value of outreach and education. I think that we are in an environment right now in this country where we are witnessing an historic breakdown in people's faith in all institutions across the board, the institution of government and institutions just across our social spectrum. And part of that, I believe, is because there is a lack of civic engagement, and part of that is because we just don't teach civics anymore in our classrooms and in our schools. You know, there's this famous quiz that is circulating that when you ask a certain age cohort who won the Civil War, a majority will say the British. And that's a function of just not having access to history and not having access to the traditional civics lessons that we all were taught when we were growing up. So I'd like you to amplify in your comments on the importance of education, not just in Washington, and whether the Smithsonian has a mission or would consider having a mission with respect to greater civic engagement and civic education across the country.
Thank you very much, Congressman. First of all, before when I quoted the mission statement of the increase in diffusion of knowledge, I think it's unbelievably important that the diffusion of knowledge not just involve people crossing the thresholds of our beautiful museums here in New York City and elsewhere. We have to go out and help people where they live. And as I mentioned just very briefly in my opening remarks, the education work of the Smithsonian, for example, in STEM disciplines, and I'm going to get back to the social sciences in a moment, is very, very well established throughout the country as people wish to use it. As you know, our K-12 system is a local phenomenon largely, and therefore varies a lot. But we are there for people who want to use it, and in fact, that use occurs in every single state of the United States. However, I think we could be doing even more in terms of outreach, and I think that outreach could and should occur in two directions. It's one thing for us to go out and offer, all we can do is offer, educational services and arts and culture and history and science for that matter, or to partner with people who want to do scientific research, as Congresswoman Pingree brought up. It's something else to get their input. And one of the hallmarks that I hope to bring to the Smithsonian, which has already been a part of it, but I hope to strengthen it, is to listen more to the public about what they want. And the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to start small and close to home. I think we owe some focus on the city of Washington, since the city of Washington is where our home base is. So with the help of Mayor Bowser, I'm establishing a youth advisory council to me from among high school students in Washington, D.C. I'm hoping that those high school students will be able to tell me what they're interested in, what they believe they need, and I want to go directly to the place where we would like the education to occur. The first meeting of this group, I hope, is going to be this very next month, and I hope to ask them the very question that you're asking me indirectly, and that is, what do you think you need that we could do for you? In terms of a more direct answer to your question about the lack of focus on civics, as I'm sure you know, because I know it's an area of interest of yours and everyone on the subcommittee, there is a lot of consternation about where American youth are in terms of their knowledge of American history and civics. There's other organizations, nonprofits, that have been brought up to actually deal specifically with the civics problem. And I think that what we can do is really three things at the Smithsonian. We can offer the exposure to the history of the United States and its culture through the collections themselves. Secondly, these museums already offer enormous numbers and very effective types of public programs, public outreach programs. Some of those are done through the Smithsonian Associates. Some of them are done individually in different ways. And again, all we can do is offer and hope that they'll come. And then thirdly, I want to go out and find out what the public would like from us. And in asking those questions, ask, what could we do to be helpful in broadening your perspectives? And just one quick end to this very long, windy answer. When I have a few minutes in my daily schedule, I like to walk away from my office and go to the museums and talk to the visitors, talk to the families and the tourists who come. And one of the things that they ask most consistently, it's not a scientific sample, but just in my 9 months of asking them, is the parents will ask, what can you do to help my kids understand a bewilderingly changing world? And if they don't specifically ask about civics, they do ask, what can you help us to bring our kids along? So I really appreciate the question and your thrust.
Well, if you would find some time to visit with me in my office, I would love to follow up on this and specifically understand what kind of outreach you have to teachers in schools across America and how we could be helpful. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, and we'd love to spend the day with you, Doctor, but unfortunately, we have to go vote and saved by the bell. And I would like to get into more depth, maybe somewhere down the road. I'll visit the Air and Space Museum with you, and because that is a huge number, as you know, and we're see if there's find out how we're going to do this. So, but I know it has to be done. It's your most visited museum, and it's certainly a national treasure. With that, we're adjourned.
Thank you very much.